The last major organ we're going to talk about, or endocrine organ we're going to talk about, is the pancreas. And the pancreas is a triangular gland partially behind the stomach. It's this little yellow structure and kind of lays kind of behind the stomach like that. Okay. And the pancreas is unique in that it has both exocrine and endocrine cells. Again, remember, exocrine means it's going to secrete a substance onto the surface. This exocrine function really has to do or plays a large role in the digestive system. And then it also has endocrine function, which again means it's going to secrete those substances or those hormones into the bloodstream. Okay. Again, there's a certain population of cells called acinar cells. These are the ones that have exocrine function. And then we have a population of cells known as our pancreatic islet cells. And these cells, also known as the islets of Langerhans, contain our endocrine cells. And we can kind of see these pockets here located in our pancreatic tissue. Now, within these pancreatic islets, we have two populations of cells, alpha cells and beta cells. And these alpha cells and beta cells will release hormones based on, or two different hormones based on the glucose levels within the body. So alpha cells will produce glucagon. And these are a hyperglycemic hormone, which means when our blood glucose levels are low, it will increase our glucose levels. And our beta cells will produce insulin, which are a hypoglycemic hormone, which means when our blood glucose levels are high, it will trigger the decrease of our blood glucose levels. Okay? So when we look at glucagon, again, glucagon will be released in response to a decrease in blood glucose. Okay? Glucagon will be secreted from those alpha cells, and it will target the liver. Okay? And it will target the liver to do two major things. One, it will take lactic acid and non-carbohydrates and convert them into glucose. And this is a process known as gluconeogenesis. It will also take our stores of glucose in the form of glycogen. So glycogen is our storage form. Okay. So glucagon will take glycogen and break it down into glucose in a process known as glycogenolysis. Okay. Both of these events, as you can see, result in, whether it's the breakdown of a molecule to form glucose or the synthesis from a different molecule to form glucose, both of these will cause the release of glucose into the blood, ultimately resulting in an increase in blood glucose. Okay, so again, in the case here, right, decrease blood glucose causes glucagon to increase, which causes an increase in glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis, which causes an increase in blood glucose. Whew. Okay. Okay. So the reason this is considered a hyperglycemic hormone, hyper again meaning excess, right? Because its effect is to increase blood glucose. Okay. Insulin, on the other hand, does the exact opposite. Okay. So the end result of glucose is to lower blood glucose levels. Okay. So let's look at this. So we have an increase in blood glucose sensed by the pancreas. The beta cells will release insulin. Okay. Now, insulin will do a few things. The first thing it will do is target pretty much every cell in the body, okay, to increase glucose uptake. Glucose uptake is kind of Absorption, you can think of it as absorption into the cells. Okay. And the other thing it does is it inhibits production of new glucose. So we go back, it inhibits, right, this event here from occurring because we don't want to produce more glucose. We're trying to decrease our blood glucose levels. Okay. But what it will do in the liver is it will take that excess glucose and it will form glycogen in a process called glycogenesis. Okay. Now, insulin isn't needed for every single tissue in the body. The liver, the kidney, and the brain can actually function independent of insulin. They can work just fine, or insulin or glucose can get into those cells just fine in the absence of insulin. Okay. So one homeostatic imbalance that many of you have probably heard of is diabetes mellitus. So diabetes mellitus is an imbalance of insulin. And there's two types of diabetes mellitus that exist. One is due to a hyposecretion of insulin. So in this case, there's no insulin production. Okay, so type 1 people don't produce insulin. These tend to be the ones that rely on injecting themselves with insulin. Okay, and then there's hypoactivity. These people produce insulin just fine. However, their insulin resistance. Okay. They produce insulin just fine. However, their cells are not responsive to that insulin. Okay. Type 2 is typically associated with obesity. So as you gain weight, that adipose tissue production, as you increase adipose tissue, for some reason, your cells become less responsive in the body to insulin. So type 2 can be corrected, type 1 cannot. Okay. So ultimately what happens in these cases is, regardless if you have type 1 or type 2, okay, your blood glucose levels remain high, okay, because there's no way of taking that glucose out of the bloodstream. This can lead to nausea, okay, and these high blood glucose levels can actually lead to a fight or flight response. So the activation, right, of our sympathetic nervous system. Okay. This results in glycosuria. Okay. Essentially, here is sugar in urine. Okay. So essentially what happens is, in these patients, you end up detecting, in uncontrolled diabetes, you end up detecting glucose in your urine. Okay. In patients with diabetes mellitus, what happens is fat is then used as their cellular fluid. Okay. This often can lead to lipidemia. And if it's severe enough, if their diabetes is uncontrolled sufficiently enough, or is severely uncontrolled, I guess you could think of it, okay, or if their blood glucose levels become too high, what'll happen is their body essentially starts forming ketones, okay, which is a consequence of the body utilizing fats as opposed to carbohydrates in generation of energy. And what happens is this leads to the presence of ketones in your urine and something called ketoacidosis. And ketoacidosis, okay, it's kind of what it sounds like. So these ketone bodies are acidic, okay? So acidosis, right? So your bodies become acidic due to those ketone bodies. Leads to hyperpnea, okay, disrupted heart activity and oxygen transport, depression of the nervous system, and then ultimately leads to coma and death, okay? So this imbalance in the acidity of the body has really severe consequences, Some signs, some classic 3 signs that we see with diabetes mellitus, okay? Polyuria, poly meaning many, urea meaning urine, okay? They tend to have a very high urine output, which means they pee a lot, okay? And that is because glucose acts as an osmotic diuretic, which means if this is our kidney tubule, right, and this is urine output, right, the presence of glucose in this tubule pulls water in. That's what we mean by an osmotic diuretic. Okay. Polydipsia, here's many. Again, poly meaning many. Dipsia means thirst. Okay, so we have excessive thirst. Okay, and again, polydipsia is due to the fact that we're losing all of this water due to the glucose. Okay, and polyphagia, okay, is an excess hunger and food consumption. And that is because essentially the cells in the body, if they don't have carbohydrates and they don't have glucose, you're essentially starving them to death. And so they think, oh my God, I don't have enough energy. I need to consume more food. Okay, and so it's kind of this vicious circle that occurs. Okay, so that's the pancreas, and those are the homeostatic imbalances in the hormones that are released from the pancreas. I'm going to end up just talking about the last few slides here in this recording, because we only have 3 more slides left. The last few organs of the reproductive system, I have one for ovaries and placenta, I have one for testes, and then I have, just want to make a blanket statement about other hormones, other hormone producing structures in the body besides our endocrine organs. Okay, so our ovaries, or our gonads, produce our sex steroid hormones. When we talk about gonads, again, when we're in the female reproductive system, we're talking about the ovaries, and the male, we're talking about the testes. Okay, so the ovaries produce estrogen and progesterone. Again, what's targeting these are LH and FSH from our anterior pituitary. And estrogen basically helps with the maturation or the development of reproductive organs, the appearance, again, of secondary sex characteristics. And in conjunction with progesterone, helps with breast development and cyclic changes during uterine menstruation and in mucosa development. This placenta, which is a organ that develops to support the developing fetus when a woman becomes pregnant, secretes estrogens, progesterone, and a hormone known as human chorionic gonadotropin. This is the hormone that is often associated, they believe to be associated with morning sickness. The testes are going to produce testosterone. And again, remember, the testes also are targeted by FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary. Okay. Again, does similar what the female reproductive system does in the female and the male. Testosterone will initiate maturation of the male reproductive organs, again, development of the male reproductive organs, cause appearance of male secondary sexual characteristics, as well as sex drive. It's required for normal sperm production, as well as maintaining reproductive organs in a functional state. Now, at the very beginning of our PowerPoint, we talked about kind of this outline, and what you saw here in this kind of light gray area were hormones secreted by other organs. I'm not going to go into substantial depth here just because we will highlight some of these as we move through this semester, but I just want to bring to your attention that what we just talked about in the bulk of this chapter are the endocrine organs and the hormones secreted by those endocrine organs. Now, in the first recording I mentioned to you, there are organs in the body that have endocrine function because they secrete hormones, right? So here I'm just going to kind of highlight those. I'm not really going to talk about the function of any of these hormones because, again, we'll talk about that substantially when we get into the organ systems that cover these. But for example, adipose tissue, right? That's going to be the storage form for our energy. However, it also has an endocrine function because it secretes 3 major hormones: leptin, resistin, and adiponectin. Okay, the stomach and small intestines, right? We know that the stomach and small intestines are part of the digestive system. We know they're involved in breakdown and reabsorption of nutrients, but they also have endocrine function because they secrete hormones known as gastrin and secretin, cholecystokinin, and serotonin. Okay? The heart, right? A lot of people don't realize the heart has endocrine function. Again, not an endocrine organ because it's part of the cardiovascular system. However, it does secrete a hormone known as atrionatriuretic peptide, ANP. We'll talk about that here in a few weeks. Okay? And then the last one is the kidneys. Again, kidneys part of the urinary system. However, they secrete two major hormones, erythropoietin and renin, okay, which means they also have endocrine function. Okay? So that ends our chapter 16, endocrine system.